Did the charges get dropped against Diddy? Not quite. Hi, I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and it is time for another Daily Diddy, bringing you daily trial updates from the P. Diddy trial until we get a verdict. So everyone's been abuzz today, and the headlines were like, oh my gosh, charges were dropped against Diddy. That's not quite what happened. So let me break this down for you. First off, this is all pertaining to the top charge, which is racketeering, also known as RICO. I'm going to break that down in a second. But RICO requires there to be 2 predicate crimes. There's a whole long list. Now, originally, the prosecution was going to rely on arson and kidnapping. The arson of Kid Cudi's car and the kidnapping of Capricorn Clark when she was held in a room forced to take a polygraph. They decided not to use those crimes, but to use 2 different ones. So they are now going to be traveling under the theories of sex trafficking and forced labor. So sex trafficking in terms of either Cassie or Jane, and also looking at forced labor in terms of Mia, any number of the assistants, right? Because they all basically got on the stand and said they weren't allowed to sleep. They worked for days and days on end. They used, Brandon Paul even talked about how he had to use drugs to stay awake. So any one of those folks could probably fit the bill in terms of forced labor. So the way it works is that for racketeering, the prosecution has to prove a couple things. Let me tell you what those elements are. So first off, they have to prove that there's an enterprise. An enterprise is really broad in terms of it could be a corporation, it could be a bunch of people, it doesn't have to be a gang, it could be a legitimate business. So that's the first part. So the second element is it has to be a person. Now, the person could be an individual, a corporation, anyone that has a legal interest in the enterprise, and that person has to be associated with the enterprise. So the person's Diddy, and he's clearly a part of Bad Boy Entertainment, Bad Boy Productions, whatever. Also, there has to be a pattern of racketeering activity, which means there has to be 2 predicate acts within the last 10 years. So that goes back to what I was talking about earlier about how the prosecution originally was going after the whole Kid Cudi thing with the arson of the car and the kidnapping of Capricorn Clark. They've now decided to focus on sex trafficking, which again, could be Jane, it could be Cassie, and also forced labor. So those are the 2 predicate crimes that they're picking. I think that was a mistake. The Capricorn Clark kidnapping, he had a gun to her head. Hello, armed kidnapping. Next up, they have to prove that there is some effect on interstate commerce. Again, he goes back and forth between states. He's got businesses. Basically, he's based in New York. He's based in Miami. He's in California. So that's easy. That's a gimme. And then the last part is injury to a business or property, or basically somebody suffering a loss as a result of this. You can easily argue Cassie, Jane, any of a number of people have had negative impacts. So those are the 5 things that the prosecution has to prove. They've got to prove that there's an enterprise, that the person is connected to the enterprise, there was a pattern of racketeering activity, there was an effect on interstate commerce, and somebody got hurt. Boom, that's that. Next up is sex trafficking. Now, sex trafficking is 3 elements. 1, you're being transported. 2, the purpose is sex. 3, the whole driver is fear, fraud, or coercion. It has to be one of those 3 things. So that's how they prove sex. So here's where it gets interesting for the sex trafficking aspect. So there's 2 counts of sex trafficking. One has to do with Cassie and one has to do with Jane. The one for Cassie is going to be a lot easier because the aspects of fear is very clear. The beating tape from the Intercontinental Hotel shows what happens if she does not want to do a freak off per his demands. So yeah, fear, coercion, that's an easy gimme. Jane is a little harder because of the money back and forth, like he was paying her bills and all of that. She kept trying to pursue a relationship, but without the freak offs and the hotel nights, whatever they called it in that instance. But again, it's not as straightforward as it is with Cassie. So that's where the prosecution's going to have a hurdle. But the last 2 charges they have is transportation for the purposes of prostitution. That's super easy. I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, transportation for the purposes of prostitution. There's 2 counts, one having to do with Cassie and one having to do with Jane. The prosecution needs to prove 3 things. First off, that there's transportation. Secondly, that the intent was for the person who was transported to engage in illegal sexual activity, vis-a-vis prostitution. And lastly, the knowledge. The defendant had to know that they were transporting people and, again, had the intent for them to be involved in prohibited sexual activity. That is the easiest gimme of all of this because it's quite simple. You have all the receipts showing that they were flying sex workers all around the country for the purposes of these freak-offs. You put Jane and you put Cassie on a plane to go have sex with said sex workers. That's it. That's transportation for the purposes of prostitution. That's the easiest charge they got. That's a max of 10 years. If he's convicted on both, the judge can run a concurrent, 20 years. So, okay, summing up for today. Remember, there's 5 charges against Diddy. The top charge is racketeering. That's life in prison. I think the prosecution has laid everything out for that charge. They have to pull it together in closing. They have to lip sync for their life in that closing argument, leave it all on the floor because the elements are there. They just have to bring it all together for the jury. So that's the max of life in prison. Then there's 2 counts of sex trafficking, one for Jane, one for Cassie. That's a max of 20 years in prison. I think the sex trafficking for Cassie is very straightforward. Jane is a little muddy, but there's still a possibility of conviction there. And then the last 2 charges are for transportation for the purposes of prostitution. One for Jane, one for Cassie. Both have a max of 10 years. Again, easy gimme because he put him on a plane and he had him have sex with sex workers. End of. So we'll see what they say in closing arguments tomorrow. I'll see ya. Bye.